There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. We're going to dive right into some fun stuff today, but first let me tell you who's joining me. As always, I've got Nephi Cole to my right.
Still here.
And technically, Mike McGrady to my left, or right across from me, however you want to.
I'm probably more right than you two, so I'm the right of right.
He's clockwise.
I don't know.
Yeah.
You two can
counterclockwise.
You two can battle it out for who's the farthest right.
Well, we know both of our.
Well.
Anyways, go ahead.
Anyway, yeah. So today, first of all, we're going to dive in. We're going to talk constitutional right to hunt and fish. We're going to talk about state efforts to pass constitutional amendments on hunting and fishing. Let me start off first. Before we do that, I want to introduce somebody to you all today. He's somebody that joined us. It's got to be something like 20 episodes ago. I don't remember which episode it was, but it was an episode we had with a number of game wardens from around the country, getting different perspectives from wardens all around the country.
That was episode 14.
Episode 14. Yeah. So if you haven't checked that out, go back and check it out. Pretty unique opportunity to have a discussion with such a diverse group of wardens from around the country. Now he's joining us in a different capacity. Because he has agreed to join the Your Mountain team and help us out as we expand our offerings. So Shawn Blajszczak is going to be writing articles for us.
Shawn, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate the opportunity.
Welcome to the mountain.
Hey, welcome to Your Mountain.
Wait a minute. That was mine. Oh, it is Your Mountain.
Or our mountain.
Yeah, our.
Well,
welcome to our mountain.
No, it's Your Mountain.
All right. Welcome to Your Mountain.
There you go.
Shawn, welcome.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks for joining us as part of the team and taking on the challenge of writing some of these articles about a host of topics.
We're really looking forward to reading this one.
We are. Why don't you tee it up for us? What were you taking on here? What were you looking at?
I was looking at the current constitutional rights for different states across the U.S. and the recent trend in, gaining constitutional rights for hunting and fishing. So that's mainly what I was looking at and, what the challenges were and, how the strengths were for them and the weaknesses.
And that's what, that's what we want to dedicate this episode to is some of your findings, some of the history that got us to the point where we have these amendments, and so let's walk through some of that
history.
Yeah, let's first really quick, let's talk about why we wanted to do this. Right? Why did we want to have this episode? Why is it relevant and timely? And I think if you go back and listen to a couple of the episodes we've had prior to this one, we've talked about Sunday hunting laws, and we did an episode that was talking about it. It was really surveying some of state legislative actions around the country and how those might impact hunting and fishing in your states. I think what we're finding, and we're seeing it crop up more and more every year, is we have state legislatures that are taking on means and methods of hunting, and are proposing things like in New Jersey, for example, where a governor comes in and says, you know what, no more black bear hunting.
Yeah. Or
California saying no mountain lion hunting.
Yeah. And in the case of New Jersey, following a very rigorous public process to make that, wait a minute.
Or
he didn't
or none
follow
whatsoever.
A rigorous
just fulfilling a campaign promise, right, on day one.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how that works. It's really trendy right now to curtail rights, isn't it?
It feels that, and the question is, are they rights? Right? And that's one of the things we want to talk about. Are we curtailing rights? Liberties? What are we curtailing? But what we do know is we know that this country was founded upon the openness and availability of game for the public to hunt and consume, right? that was a big part.
That was part of life at the time.
Part of life. It's always been part of life in this country, in the United States.
Yeah,
right?
it's part of our history and our culture.
Yeah,
but that wasn't always the case everywhere.
No, in fact, it's not the case a lot of places, but it certainly wasn't the case everywhere. And it might be because of that. Might be the reason we are the way we are.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so when you say it wasn't the case anywhere, I'm assuming you're
everywhere,
referring
everywhere or forever. Yeah, I mean, I think what Nephi is referring to is 802 years ago or so, we got the Magna Carta come out. That
absolutely, one of my favorite documents.
Ding, ding, ding! Got to get that in.
Yeah,
get that reference in.
Had a written reference to the right to hunt. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. I mean, my great. I don't know how many greats, but a long time ago. I mean, I had a bunch of family over there wandering around when that was happening, and they were in an entirely different world.
Yeah,
it was more than 800 years ago. I don't think I did my math right.
Yeah, the Magna Carta.
Well, you're an attorney. You're not supposed to do math.
Was more than 800 years ago, but not by a lot.
No,
that's what accountants are for.
We're not going to do the math. It's like, well, we're not going to do the math.
That's right.
Let's just say you're close enough.
Yeah, right.
Close enough for lawyer work.
If somebody'd like to join the team as just a number cruncher.
But yeah, so the history that I think we're all referring to, really, without going all the way back to the Magna Carta, but you can fast forward from that a few hundred years, is English game laws, and how English game laws made hunting really a monopoly of those that were privileged to hunt by the authority of the crown. So the crown controlled the wildlife and gave folks the authority to hunt that wildlife, right? And in fact, set up really draconian penalties if you violated the laws of the crown. So if you or I or Mike, but probably you or I or Shawn, well, all of us, if we were to go onto these properties and we were to kill a deer or a swan or a fox or whatever it happened to be, we could be penalized by death, right? And that's a pretty stiff penalty for taking game, right? And why a death penalty? Why a death penalty for game, and why such control over game?
Because it was about more than just game, right? I mean, there were other things too that they prohibited, the lower class to have, because it was really about control, wasn't it?
Weapons, for example,
exactly.
Right? I mean, it was political control.
Yeah, it was
prevent uprising. Those in power wanted to keep power and prevent those without power from having it.
Yeah. And so these, freedoms, and I mean, that's what they were, freedoms like that, the ability to go take care of oneself, defend oneself. Like, those were things that if you can keep somebody from having that level of liberty, you control them. They depend on you for food. They depend on you for defense and protection. And that's a powerful thing.
Right. And so hunting was prohibited. Fast forward, and the English started colonizing the United States, or what is now the United States. And in the colonies, people were free to hunt. And the one of the more famous English jurists of the time, that was alive at the time of the colonies, right, was this gentleman named William Blackstone. Very famous.
Yeah, it's not that he was just famous back then. He's
famous today.
Now.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those he stands the test of time kind of jurists.
Sure, you still study him in law school.
You study him in law school.
Yeah.
So William Blackstone was, when he was talking about hunting in the colonies and the impact that hunting had by colonials, he said, he noted, for example, the accurate marksmanship that was exhibited by the provincials at the Battle of Bunker Hill. As we all know, Bunker Hill was a very famous battle during the American Revolution. And he made this comment. He said, and he quotes, he says this marksmanship was exhibited, in quotes, that this marksmanship was derived from hunting and the ordinary amusement of sportsmen. The dexterity which by long habit they had acquired in hitting beasts, birds, and marks was fatally applied to the destruction of British officers.
This is really interesting and kind of funny because, he says British officers, right?
Yeah.
Boy, they frowned upon that because at that time, that was like a no-no. You left the British officers alone. Didn't matter what happened to all the underlings there, but you didn't go after British officers. And then here you have these colonists who, you know, I wrote an article for Long Range Magazine and talked about the development of the rifle and how that's such an American development, the Kentucky long rifle. So you had these guys who were using a rifle that was more accurate, more technologically. I mean, it was state of the art in terms of hunting technology and arms of the time. And it was, much better than what the British, came to the field with, much more accurate. It was not a weapon of, it was not this clumsy weapon that the British were using. It was an instrument that had to be used by somebody who knew what they were doing. It was like a high level of accuracy involved in it. It required you to be a master of your craft.
So the colonists were accurate, and they had better weapons, and they were more they're more proficient in the use of those weapons.
And it was just an entirely different thing. The British were, this concept of armies at the time was basically Napoleonic, right? It's like you could have backtracked to people, charging each other with horses and spears and, gunpowder and whatnot. The way the British were working was kind of the same thing. It was just a different kind of spear. And that's not what the colonists did.
So I'm going to step out on a limb here.
Yeah.
A really long limb.
Yep.
And I'm going to say, because we're all hunters, right? And it's a big part of our own personal heritage. I'm going to say that it's such a big part of our country's heritage that if it were not for hunters, we might not have the United States of America today.
There's no question that is the case. If you go back and look at the militias and the people who came, it was these men who came from the frontier. They came from, they were frontiersmen. They were guys who were out there who had certain skill sets, certain abilities, and the tools of the frontier, and they leveraged those in a way that the British Army could not cope with.
So if you like your freedoms, if you like the Constitution, thank a hunter. Go hug a hunter.
Go hug a hunter. I love this.
Right? I think we're onto something here. I think this is spot on.
Mike needs a hug. He looks like it right now.
Mike looks like he disagrees with this.
I don't disagree one bit. I dare someone to prove us wrong.
Yes. Somebody take up that dare. Because I don't think it can be done. Yeah, you were saying something, Shawn?
I was going to say mankind in general wouldn't exist if it wasn't for hunters. We were hunters and gatherers originally.
The part of that, what I wrote about in that article is this idea. I mean, really it is a craft. And I think people have tried to wrongly kind of separate us into groups, but this, it is what we've been doing. It is that skill set, that field craft aspect of it. It's truly American. Think about Lewis and Clark.
Yeah.
What the skills that they took. This was a group of Army officers, right?
Right.
And that is really what we are as a nation. We're a nation of more than just, military, more than just explorers, but kind of this unique combination of, frontiersmen and adventurous. And it's really exciting, but it is who we are. And when you say, when other countries are like, oh, Americans, the cowboys or whatever, like they're really talking about that, that spirit that we still maintain, that spirit of drive, that spirit of adventure, that spirit of, I won't be beaten, that still exists.
So I think Shawn brings up a good point, though, about being hunters and gatherers and the original sort of, we've always been this way. And so the question is it a God-given right? Or is it something that we've invented for ourselves?
Well, and that's,
I know what I'd argue.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a great question. And I think our country debated that at its formation.
That's right.
Right. We had this debate. We had, for example, folks from Pennsylvania. At the time, we were talking about what should be in our Constitution. We're talking about what the Second Amendment. We all know the Second Amendment, right? Second Amendment, right to bear arms, right? We all know what the Second Amendment is, but we don't all know what it could have been. Right? And what Pennsylvania had been proposing at the time was that we should actually have, the right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state, and also that the inhabitants of the state shall have liberty to fowl and hunt in seasonable times on the lands they hold and on all other lands therein not enclosed.
Way to go, Pennsylvania.
That's what Pennsylvania wanted. They wanted to protect through the Constitution the ability to hunt.
Yeah,
right?
they recognize they recognize that additional piece, not just the arms for self-defense.
Right. They viewed it as a fundamental right.
Yep.
But others actually disagreed, but maybe not for the reasons you might think they disagreed. Right. So you had Virginia, a Virginia Federalist named Alexander White, and he argued against these provisions that would created this fundamental right for hunting, right? And saying specifically that these provisions were out of the power of Congress and were proposed to induce the ignorant to believe that Congress would have a power over such objects.
Yeah, basically it's God-given right, and man can't take it away.
Yeah. So basically he's saying by even talking about this, by suggesting that we're giving you the right,
Sure.
we're acting like you don't already have it, but everybody has it.
Absolutely. That was part of the big discussion at this time. We were trying to figure out as a nation, what do we need to put in this Constitution? What do we need to establish as rights? Do we need to establish them? I mean, there were a lot of debates around what should be or should not be in the Bill of Rights at all. It ultimately came down to 10 that they all agreed upon. However, there was a huge philosophical debate of those things that you don't even need to write this down. This is just so far beyond ever going to happen. That,
who would try and take that away? It's
the freedom of press and the right to bear arms and those things. There are a whole host of folks saying we don't need to have a Bill of Rights. We don't need to, that's just the way it is. Sort of that natural law theory of just how things operated at that time frame.
But high five to whoever went over to at least get some of those things squirreled away in the 10.
Got a few of them, but even the ones that they got in the 10, and we know that we've got the second and the right to bear arms. But even at that time, as they're agreeing on this, folks that are interpreting it at the time, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention that are going back home and saying, hey, folks, here's what I think this provision, here's what we intend this to mean. Here's what this means. We have a gentleman, Samuel Nasson. I'm going to pronounce his last name incorrectly, and I'm embarrassed by that, but he's from Massachusetts, and he wrote about the Second Amendment, the effect of the Second Amendment. He says, then there will be no dispute between the people and rulers in that may be secured the right to keep arms for common and extraordinary occasions, such as to secure ourselves against the wild beast, and also to amuse us by fowling, and for our defense against a common enemy. With the Oxford comma,
that's right,
fowling comma, and for the defense against.
We're not amusing ourselves with going after the enemy.
I do have to say that there is a certain amount of irony to the states that, like, kind of the positions of the different states that were quoted here. So Pennsylvania right now, of course, is trying to work through Sunday hunting, and they're going to get there. Pennsylvania, we got your back. You make it happen. But then you got Virginia and then Massachusetts, right? And so some of these, you see some of the challenges, some of the real heavy duty arguments about not just about the Second Amendment rights right now and hunting rights are still occurring in these places.
Yeah. And we actually had some state law in the early 19th century that was interpreting the Second Amendment, and not even really the Second Amendment so much as interpreting the right to hunt, whether the right to hunt exists, and saying that yes, it does. And folks at the time recognized, like we've talked about, folks at the time recognized that this is just the way things were. Nobody questioned whether the right really existed.
It's like asking, do you have the right to go to the mini mart and get gas?
Well, sure.
You say, of course I do.
Any damn fool would know.
Yeah.
Standard.
Except 9 damn fools in 1971.
Well, let's talk about those.
Yeah, let's do. And those 9 would be the members, and this is, I shouldn't phrase it that, I shouldn't be so cavalier with the Supreme Court.
It's going to come back and haunt you someday when you're up for...
Yeah, right. Of nothing. but these members of the Supreme Court in 1971, in the case of Baldwin v. Fish and Game Commission of Montana, without diving into, there's no need for us to really dive into the facts around that case or go through that case, except to say that the court did establish at that time that hunting is not a fundamental right under the United States Constitution. Now,
So it was Baldwin that was claiming it was, and the Montana Game and Fish were the ones that saying the commission was the one saying it wasn't.
no. Like I said, we don't need to dive into the facts of this because
All
I
right.
think this really involved resident versus non-resident hunting allocations and that sort of
That
thing.
makes
And in
sense.
the context of this entire argument, this
Individual comes into Montana, says he has a right.
right.
I
So
get
For what you're saying, I'm hoping it's dicta.
yeah, right. Anyway,
That's attorney speak for
that's
something.
Yeah.
but that's one of the things that the court said in this case. Hunting is not a fundamental right. But at the time, only one state in the country had their own state constitutional provision
Right.
addressing hunting and identifying hunting as a right, and that was Vermont in 1777. And I know, Shawn, you wrote about this. So, we know Vermont has this in 1777. Why? Why made them do
Vermont
it?
originally was going to become its own nation before we became a United States, and it was sort of a slap in the face to the British system of only allowing, elite people to hunt and fish, as well as, making sure their citizens could provide for themselves by hunting. I think it was a little bit of both and just enjoy those activities.
Yeah, and that is something that's interesting is, the U.S. Constitution didn't come into being until, 1791? And here we have a state constitution that predates the U.S. Constitution, 1777, addressing this. And you're saying that at that time, Vermont was looking at becoming its own sovereign nation.
So they were saying this is not important to us in Vermont. Does Vermont, out of curiosity, do they have a right to hunt and fish in their state constitution now?
Yes.
They've had that since 1777.
All right,
Yep, they have. It's never went away.
Ladies and
Still there.
gentlemen, it is late at night,
Yeah.
and
So
I'm out of Monster Energy drinks,
So yes, their constitutional provision predates the United States Constitution.
and it's still there.
It predates it probably came into conjunction with the Articles of Confederation that preceded the United States Constitution.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Let me go find another one of these purple monsters.
So then, Shawn, when you were researching this, so you have 1777. When were the next? When did the next state adopt its own constitutional amendment?
The next state to adopt it was Alabama in 1996. Between Vermont and Alabama, really the only people who were given the right to hunt and fish were Native Americans through treaties. So that's the only other thing I did notice between those two states. But yeah, it took over 200 years for the next state to develop rights.
That's an interesting point you raised.
It's actually fascinating.
It's really fascinating. That would warrant maybe its own podcast. Oh, wait. we did one.
But that is...
Well, we did one, but we could go through the series of case law that kind of got to the point that he's talking about, as opposed to the modern day interpretation of it.
Oh, sure.
Anyways.
At some point in the future, but as far as the
it was clearly recognized.
A treaty right between the tribe and the federal government to clearly articulate and recognize a right to hunt
for the tribe.
Right.
So that they had the right. I mean, but here's the funny thing: it's not just, correct me if I'm wrong, but they didn't just say they have the right to hunt. It was almost implicit that they had the right to do that. It was more in relation to where they had the right to do that, which almost implicitly indicates that we'd have that right too.
Yeah,
I find it funny.
I don't know that I wouldn't quite go there.
Yeah, I guess
I
I
went
was bringing up the Marshall trilogy
Mhm.
and
Right.
the idea of the way we kind of got to that point, but the way in the 1800s, kind of when this is occurring, it was thought of as it wasn't that it was a constitutional right under the United States Constitution as much as it was
right.
one country negotiating with another.
Right. It was a treaty.
We were recognizing something that they already had.
Right. Exactly.
All right. So
Yep. So anyway, but that's a good point you make, Shawn, that we had recognized these rights for treaties with tribes, but we had not necessarily recognized it with.
Yeah.
It was inherent. We thought it was inherent.
And that's
with
what
other
I'm
people,
saying,
but there
like,
hadn't been an
right,
effort
so
It
to
was
make
inherent.
So in 1777, we've got at least one state. This is we're going to take our point. We're going to make sure that everybody knows.
It's a political point.
Everybody knows that this is the case, and there was no occasion between that occurrence in 1777 and in 1996, when Alabama, the next state, comes along, that 219 years all went along just fine. The only thing that really threw things off was in the 1970s, where you have a Supreme Court that has different attitudes, different ideas of things, interpreting the law, as opposed to what everybody would have just known.
But then you also have
the late 1777 time frame,
and then you have the rise. And I just call it in the mid part of the 20th century, the rise of the environmental movement that really started picking up steam. As
a consequence of the Industrial Revolution and the urbanization of everything.
Right. Yeah. So you move away from the agrarian culture that our country was really settled under, and you move towards urbanization, suburbia, and then you have the rise of the environmental movement, tied to that. And then you have Silent Spring authored, right, pointing out, rivers on fire and all that kind of stuff. But there's not to diminish that, but then there's a kind of a rise in this of an animal rights movement. And one of the things in that animal rights movement that starts getting some traction is calling into question the types of animals people are hunting, or the ways in which they're hunting, or the mechanisms in which they hunt, and you start seeing laws passed in states that are starting to erode some of what had been traditional methods of take or traditional species, and so states start to get a little bit nervous about this. All for hundreds of years we thought this was an inherent right, and now we're seeing this right peeled away, challenged.
Yeah, I mean, and you can see the tactic is the tactic. It sounds callous to say the tactic is obvious, but when you can pick something and begin to whittle away at it, how do you eat an elephant?
One bite at a time.
One bite at a time. Yeah.
And it's delicious.
I don't know. I've never had elephant.
I haven't either.
It's presumptuous, but maybe it is delicious. I don't know. So, Shawn, as you're diving into this, so we know you tell us Alabama in 1996. And then I'm assuming we start to see a ramp up. How many states today, as we sit here talking, how many states today have adopted a constitutional amendment to protect, in some way, protect or preserve the hunting and fishing heritage or right? We're going to talk about those differences a little bit too. But how many states?
A total of 22 states now allow for a right for hunting and fishing. There's a couple states that have statutes that provide similar rights, and then there's also 2 states that only have rights for fishing. But yeah, the ramp up definitely has been going since 1996, and it's still going. There's still other states that have proposed amendments that haven't passed yet, but are working towards that in the future.
So of these states, of these 22 states, and let's just focus on those. I recognize their statutes, and I recognize there are a couple of other states that are pursuing this. But of the 22 that have adopted something, have you, as you were looking into these, as you were diving into these, were you able to parse out any distinctions? Are they very similar? Are there big distinctions between or among these constitutional amendments?
Yeah, you can sort of group them a couple ways. Some of them more recognize the fact that hunting's a good heritage and we should, keep it around. And others actually make it a right for the future, just depending on their wording. Some of them, like Louisiana, theirs is pretty strong. And there's a few other states that aren't as strong, such as Montana or Georgia, where they more recognize the tradition. And don't necessarily provide a right as much.
So I actually think Georgia's is. I might disagree with you. I actually think Georgia's is pretty strong.
So what are some examples of the different? Give us 2 examples. Pick one, and what's the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, for like Montana, the fact that they say the opportunity to harvest wild game, wild fish, and wild game animals is a heritage and shall forever be preserved. It just says it's a heritage and should be preserved. It doesn't really say
define what that really means.
It doesn't use the word right. other ones such as, let's go with Virginia. Theirs is short, but they still give people the right. The first, 5 words of it is the people have a right. And then, of course, it goes on to say to hunt and fish and harvest game. So theirs is pretty upfront right off the bat that you have a right, which I think is the stronger ones usually word it similar to that.
Well, let's dive into that distinction a little bit more, because there are a number of them that talk about this protecting this heritage, but then they'll go a little bit farther. There are some that are like Virginia's that comes right out of the gates and says there's a right. But I'll hone in on Wyoming's as an example, because Wyoming starts out by saying, the opportunity to fish, hunt, and trap wildlife is a heritage that shall forever be preserved. Which on its face, as you read, if you just stopped there, you
kind of
think
like Montana's heritage.
It's heritage, but it goes a step farther, because it says it shall ever be preserved to the individual citizens of the state, right? And so in that instance, it's really creating a right in each individual.
It's passing it. So it's not just saying it existed and it was great that it existed. It's saying it exists and it belongs to you, guy from the future, and it hands it to him.
Well, and when you talk about heritage comes with it a whole variety of things. It's not just I get to go hunt. It's a way of life that comes with it, and that's embedded in an individual. Whereas other states talk about preserving it for the people in general.
Right. And I want to go back and really quickly and, eat my own words, because I went back and looked at, I must have been thinking of a different state, because I went back and looked at that Georgia language, and Shawn, you'd mentioned that was one of the weaker ones. And I look at it again and I think, yeah, it might be. In Georgia, it's the tradition of fishing and hunting and the taking of fish and wildlife shall be preserved for the people and shall be managed by law and regulation for the public good.
But Dave, you also brought up Virginia. You told me something super interesting about that I thought was fascinating about, and Shawn, you brought it up too. But what was the Virginia's case? They came out with that a right up front. They said a right, but that was also the subject of a court case, was it not?
Yeah, and actually. So let me run through just a couple of different court cases here so you can see how the courts have applied some of these different constitutional amendments that have been adopted in different states. And there aren't a lot of examples to work from yet, even though we have 22 states with these amendments. There aren't a lot to work from, but Virginia's is pretty fascinating. And like Shawn was mentioning, Virginia has strong language, right? So in this particular case, if anybody wants to go out and find this case, it's Orion Sporting Group versus Nelson County.
I know I will.
You're probably going to look at it, right? Because it's the facts of this are pretty interesting. So the Orion Sporting Group, they operated a hunting preserve that was licensed by the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. It was on about 450 acres in Virginia. Orion wanted to expand their offerings, and they wanted to operate a sporting clays facility on that estate. Well, they had to get a permit to do that from the county. And the county board of supervisors, they approved this hunting preserve, but they denied Orion's application for the sporting clays facility. So Orion appealed that, and they actually sought a declaratory judgment from the court that the operation of a sporting clays facility is protected by the constitutional right to hunt. And what it just so we shouldn't get too deep into legal jargon, right? So from a declaratory judgment, when they're asking for a declaratory judgment, they're just asking the court to declare this is so, that this is.
What are the rights and obligations of the people involved in the case?
Right. Yep. That was the ask. So here's what the court did. And this was a lower court. The Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal. So this isn't a firm precedent. There's still an opportunity for this to go someplace else, but it's what we've got on the record right now in Virginia. Right? And so ultimately the court ruled against Orion. They said, look, this sporting clays facility is not constitutionally protected. But they did go as far as saying, that the constitutional right to hunt, fish, and harvest game under the Constitution of Virginia is a fundamental right. They laid it out and said it is a fundamental right. It's just that the definition of hunt does not include shooting sporting
So
clays.
it applies to real pigeons, not fake ones.
Real pigeons, not fake pigeons.
I get it. And by the way, I'm really not going to go back and look at that. I was
I don't know.
I just expected you to go back and look at it.
I've read that case.
I know.
Before.
I'm just saying I was not being truthful.
But there are a couple of other examples. So we talk about states that maybe that's one example of a state that has a pretty firmly defined definition that says you have a constitutional fundamental right under state constitution, a fundamental right to hunt. A couple of other states, courts have looked at it slightly differently. Minnesota and North Dakota are two of those states that I'd look at. In North Dakota, the Supreme Court, in a case where the defendant was arguing that this amendment protected a right to hunt, the North Dakota Supreme Court said, that the amendment implicitly recognized a statement of public policy, that it was a statement of public policy, but it didn't necessarily apply to the individual or bestow on the individual this right to hunt. It left that undecided. And then on the Minnesota side, an appellate court in Minnesota recognized only that Minnesota had constitutionally recognized the importance of fishing and hunting to the people of the state, but didn't go that next step and say, and the individual has a right to exercise.
Which is super interesting because it kind of does line up very interestingly with both Virginia, which mentioned the right specifically, Wyoming, which says, there's this heritage, and we hand that football to the individual so they get to carry it. And then you have these other states that said, the heritage is important, but it didn't necessarily hand the football to anybody.
Yeah, with the exception of North Dakota covering trapping, and Minnesota's not. They're basically identical language in that they talk about it being that value part of the heritage and forever preserved to the people in general.
So Shawn, when these started coming forward in the, after 1996, who was, Mike mentioned this relationship between some of the language. Who was driving that car? Who was driving that boat?
Well, to begin with, it was just states. And then the NRA actually stepped into the game and sort of gave their framework on how states should write theirs. And whether or not you're a fan of the NRA, their framework was actually really good. And it really doesn't even mention anything about, NRA other than using traditional methods. They sort of line out the framework so people know that the right and fish to hunt and harvest wildlife should be there for everyone, forever. And then they also make sure they sort of throw a bone out there to the North American model, say that it should be the primary means for, managing wildlife and controlling wildlife. And then they also make sure to mention that, it won't violate people's property rights. So they sort of hit all the top points for most states. And since they put out that document, a lot of states have been pretty close to their framework, adjusting it for their constituents. But you can tell most states have utilized that in some fashion.
It's interesting that, you mentioned the NRA carrying that forward. And again, you said it, whatever you think, whatever you may or may not think of that group, whether you're a member or not, there aren't a lot of groups out there who are putting that level of resource into furthering, into protecting and creating those opportunities. And certainly that's a group that's not afraid to take it on the chin.
And I would actually counter that there is a group that I know of that is putting that level of resource in to the other side of the equation. The Humane Society of the U.S. frequently runs bills, model legislation in other states trying to erode people's ability to hunt. And we're seeing it a lot in legislative sessions around the country right now with respect to, baiting and trapping and, other methods of take. So you have one position on the one side, and then you have the NRA on the other side trying to do whatever they can to preserve that right.
There's an article recently that came out from a large national publication. I don't remember which magazine it was, but it threw out the question, is it time for hunters to leave the NRA? And, this is one of those reasons why I think the answer probably should be no. Because if, that's a group that's out there, and if you want to pick the group that's protecting your rights and fighting for you on these things, as an individual, not as a conglomerate or as a company, but as an individual, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who is, a stronger advocate for that for you. There certainly isn't another group that I can think of, that, you're going to go, Mike's going to go join that's going to have that level of voice trying to protect those rights.
Hey, Shawn, as you were researching this, did anything surprise you? Were there any surprises along the way for you?
Not too much surprises. It seemed like some of the states didn't really, honestly, do much more than read other states and follow in suit. And some of them had harder fights than others to get these passed. And then there was even talk in states that, it was, or it didn't need to be a right because it sort of was intrinsic. I know Alaska, I saw some things that mentioned they thought it was sort of intrinsic up there, even though they don't have a state right for it. So that was one thing that sort of surprised me with some of the states, which, in the future could be weaker for them if someone challenges that kind of stuff.
We talked about the Virginia one, and one of the things I noted with Virginia's process, and we said how it has this very strong language now. During the process, they had a number of legislators that were trying to introduce language into the proposed amendment that would go out to the public for vote, that they'd add things that would say, we want to protect the right to golf, or we want to protect the right to shop, or the right to food and shelter. I mean, basically, these folks were proposing amendments in these states to prove their point, which was that it was, they had a number of points. One was it was frivolous because it wasn't being threatened by anybody yet, that it was, one of the other arguments I saw was that modern hunting is more recreational than anything. So these amendments are heightening a protection for recreation. So if we're going to do that, we should protect golf too. Those were some of the arguments coming out. I think it's missing the boat. I don't know if you agree, Shawn, but I think it's kind of those types of arguments are missing the point.
Yeah, and I think those type of arguments don't really, translate as well, considering hunting has had threats to it. It's not like there's groups out there actively attacking golf, saying no one should be able to golf anymore. So I don't see it being the same situation, even if some people take it as recreations and other people use it still for somewhat of subsistence. I think that shouldn't matter. We're just trying to protect our hunting heritage as a culture and as a country or states.
And so where do you think we go from here? If listeners here live in a state that doesn't have a constitutional amendment right now, what do you think the next step should be for them, Shawn?
I mean, if you think it's important enough to, have the talk with your legislator, that's a good way to do it. And talk with your local sportsmen's groups to get something put together so your state will have a chance for an amendment being passed. And another big thing for all states is honestly retention, recruitment, and reactivation of hunters. I mean, if you have a big crowd of people, they get a lot more voice. So that's always a struggle for, hunting and fishing in the recent past. So, keeping people out there hunting and fishing is probably just as key as anything.
And let's not forget, as we're talking about this, that the overwhelming majority, the vast majority of American citizens support the ability to hunt. Like the concept of being able to go out there and harvest your own food has overwhelming support in this country.
Yeah. I read one article that they did a study and it said 87% of people supported hunting if it was for food. It was a much lower number, I think somewhere in the 20 or 30% range that supported trophy hunting. But, that shows that overall Americans do support hunting to some degree.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've heard this argument back and forth. Someone was talking with me the other day and said, oh, the Second Amendment needs hunting. And it's really interesting if you look at those two things, because one of those things is protected by the Constitution right now, and one of them isn't. And
at least by the U.S. Constitution.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so that's, clearly, this is an issue that we need to be careful about and we need to protect.
And some states are doing a better job of it than others. And just politically speaking, it's far easier to navigate the halls of your state capital and move a constitutional amendment forward for a state constitution than it is to go through the process of amending the United States Constitution to once and for all declare what we all thought was an inherent fundamental right from the birth of this country, of a right to hunt. So the path forward to really have these rights indoctrinated for now and forever is really through that state process.
Yeah, and if you don't think it's important, let's go back to the right to keep and bear arms again. And if you can see the erosion or the attempted erosion of something that is a constitutional right, what about something that isn't?
And you can say the same thing for the First Amendment too, on speech. I mean, there's, you have these rights laid out that people are constantly trying to erode, and you're exactly right. And you have something where
one bite at a time.
You have something where, as we talked about early in this podcast, if it weren't for hunters,
we wouldn't even be here.
This country would not exist because we would have lost the war against England, right? Well, maybe we wouldn't have taken up arms in the first place against England, if it weren't for hunters at the time.
There's so much history we could talk about.
I'm shedding a tear now. So prideful.
Well, you're a sensitive guy, Dave, and we appreciate that.
Hey, Shawn, do you have anything else you want to add on the topic for now?
No, not really. I would just suggest that, all sportsmen remember to help have your rights not disappear or have what your current ability to hunt is not disappear, just to be respectful to other people's opinions and respectful to your game. A lot of that stems, these other, arguments against hunting stem from people who have done things that probably weren't the most appropriate or ethical. So if people watch that, they usually will, have a better light shed on hunting and fishing and taking of wildlife in general.
Yeah, I think that's sound advice, and I think that's advice that we try and we touch on frequently. Right?
Great advice. Yeah. Don't give ammunition to the enemy.
And the other advice I'd have is for our listeners, and I say, hey, go out there and head out to our website, itsyourmountain.com, to find this article that Shawn's writing, and that we should be posting shortly after the release of this podcast, to learn more about state constitutional amendments on hunting and fishing, and to see the provisions that all the states that have them. We'll have a resource there for you to be able to see what states have them and what the language is. Big thanks to Shawn for doing this, and again, really excited that you've joined us and are writing these helpful articles. You'll be able to find them on our social media as well, at all the usual places at the handle at It's Your Mountain. So again, Shawn, thanks so much for taking the time to be here today. But more importantly, thanks so much for joining the Your Mountain team and providing what I know is going to be really useful and informative content for folks that follow this program.
All right. Well, thank you guys for allowing me the opportunity to help as well.
Oh, anytime. Hey, anybody else have anything else they want to add before we call it a night?
No, I'm good.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, for listening to this episode of the Your Mountain Podcast. Look forward to doing it again next week. And until then, just remember, life is about experiences, so go have one. Next week. And until then, just remember, life is about experiences, so go have one.